Hi, I'm Anna Keimel, and I worked with Alex Dupre, Danielle Jameson, Laurent Verpace, and Liz Rickley on the Great Marsh Mitigation Practices for Marshland Resiliency project. We focused on mitigation practices in the Great Marsh and the surrounding state and the local regulatory framework. So the Great Marsh is the largest salt marsh in New England at over 25,000 acres. It spans from northern Massachusetts to southern New Hampshire, as you can see in the top right map. And it has great economic, cultural, and environmental significance, which is characteristic of most wetlands. The bottom right image highlights the value of the Great Marsh. It provides a habitat that supports fisheries, oysters, clamming, and other coastal economies, including tourism for the regional area. It also provides natural storm protection and habitat for migratory birds and other marshland species. Additionally, wetlands act as natural filtration systems with the ability to filter pollutants out of water, and they are natural carbon sinks, where wetlands can store significantly more carbon than forested areas. Luckily, the state of Massachusetts recognizes the importance of the Great Marsh, and it is a designated area of critical environmental concern, among other designations aimed to protect this natural area. So our project partners are both members of the Great Marsh Partnership, which is a team of researchers, local political actors, educators, and community members with the goal of protecting, restoring, and enhancing the Great Marsh. We specifically are working with Peter Pippin and Greg Moore. Peter works at the Merrimack Planning Commission and the Massachusetts Bay National Estuary Program, and Greg is a coastal ecologist working at the University of New Hampshire. In addition to members of the Great Marsh Partnership, there are also partner organizations, which are seen in the top line of all the logos at the bottom of the page. And then there's additional stakeholders that have interest in the marsh's health. Some of the stakeholders that are important to highlight are the 8 towns in the Great Marsh, Mass Department of Environmental Protection, Mass DEP, and the private landowners within the Great Marsh area. So the 8 towns in the Great Marsh is a local governance committee to work on protection of coastal waters and watershed in the North Shore of Massachusetts. And Mass DEP regulates wetlands on a state level through the Wetlands Protection Act, which requires local communities to develop a conservation commission to assess wetland projects that are proposed. And then there's many private landowners throughout the Great Marsh. This adds some complexity as the marsh is not owned by a single organization. It's owned by various government agencies, municipalities, and community members. So our project is a response to efforts aimed at restoring and building resilience in the Great Marsh, where restoration focuses on addressing impacts of past practices in the marsh, from legacy agriculture and mosquito dishing. And then resilience building focuses on preparing the Great Marsh to adapt to sea level rise and continue to provide services with a changing climate. And so the figure on the left shows one idea on enhancing marsh resiliency and highlights the technique called thin layer sediment addition, which we will talk about in further detail in the next slide.
So coastal erosion is the main issue that we're kind of looking at with the marsh. It's what is threatening the marsh the most. So with sea level rise, you see a marsh drowning effect. So that is receding the low marsh area and therefore the vegetation as well. So what the natural process to follow is that the marsh will migrate inland. However, the issue is that the marsh is experiencing another phenomenon called the coastal squeeze effect, whereby when you have sea level rise, it's pushing the marsh inland, but also urban development inland that is pushing the marsh closer to the sea. It's becoming squeezed and squeezed and squeezed into a very, very small area, to the point that it could threaten its very existence as an ecosystem. So our question is, will the marsh adjust, and how? And one of the techniques that have been explored on a very minute scale has been thin layer deposition, which we'll look more into on the next slide. But you can see from the diagram that when you add a very thin layer of sediment, which is often sourced from dredging, sand, you allow for the marsh to elevate in respect to the higher sea level rise. So when you allow the marsh to have another layer, you also allow for more vegetation to grow and therefore improve the overall quality of the marsh, as well as gain elevation on the rising sea level. So yeah, again, so thin layer deposition, you take dredged sediments, through a nozzle, you apply a very, very thin layer across a designated area so that existing plants have the capacity to grow through the new sediment, and new plants can also grow closer to the actual shoreline. So if, as we can see from the pictures, it's been done, but on a very, very small scale, on a very small plot, about 1 meter by 1 meter. Additional and large-scale experimentation is going to require permitting, which is kind of the main interest of our investigation and our project, is the challenges in regards to permitting on marsh restoration techniques. And we see two interesting quotes from those that participated in our survey. One of them being the discussions with regulators in the state have pointed out that TLD, thin layer deposition, is still a relatively new and untested approach in Massachusetts. So we'll get into how novel approaches introduce some regulatory challenges later on, and that there's a sentiment that not enough scientific research has been conducted in order to support TLD as a tool. So we'll see that, with these two competing views, one saying that it's not been tested enough, but the second saying that there's not enough evidence to support it. So we see this kind of loop of we cannot test because there's not enough evidence, but how can we get enough evidence if we cannot test? So we have 3 goals and 1 method for each goal. So our first goal is to outline the evidence of novel marsh remediation techniques, which is best done through a literature review of various marsh restoration techniques from different regions of the world in the United States and abroad. We looked at areas throughout the United States, on the East Coast, the West Coast, the South, as well as northern Canada in the Nova Scotia regions, as well as in Western Europe, in Denmark, Germany, France, Ireland, and Belgium, where there are vast salt marshes. Second, we want to provide an account of the attitudes towards marsh remediation techniques and priorities within the New England region. And this is best served through a survey where we surveyed a variety of scientists, regulators, and practitioners in the New England region to gain an appreciation of the attitudes towards marsh remediation and the points of contention between regulators and conservation scientists in moving forward with projects and then the regulatory challenges that follow. And then finally, we want to build momentum around a preventative marsh remediation to create greater coordination, and that's best done through a policy recommendation. So we use the latter 2 methods to inform our policy recommendation, which one of our team members will go into more depth. So 2 restoration techniques that have been explored as of recently in the Great Marsh are runneling. So runnels have been an interesting technique as they are essentially ditches that guide water away from the marsh. And culverts are these kind of stop points that stop the flow of water and then allow it to enter in depending on the requirements of the ecosystem at a given time. So with runnels, so again, shallow ditches connecting to an existing large creeks or ditches, and there have been several case studies of this throughout the New England region in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey. And in Canada, in Nova Scotia, we've seen that culverts have been used to restore the salt marsh and replenish vibrant bird populations and various fauna and flora within that region. A main disadvantage is that it decreases tidal exchange, and tidal exchange is very important within water ecosystems, as they're important for the disbursement of sediment as well as important spread of seeds of different aquatic plants. But the solution to this was to replace existing culverts with larger ones, and we'll see how that solution has played out in various regions of the world.
Okay, so now I am going to give you a quick overview of what our survey was like, so you could better understand the results. We sent the survey out to 116 different people who work in the industry, so land managers, regulatory officials, policymakers, scientists, researchers, and some others. We had a response rate of about 49%. The survey is made up of 16 questions, 12 of which are Likert scale questions. They asked the respondents to rate how much they agreed with a statement on a 5-step scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. The neutral midpoint option was labeled neither agree nor disagree. And we asked that if this choice was chosen, that the respondent explain further as to why. The last 3 questions were open-ended questions. We asked if there were any specific techniques that would be useful in creating more resilient wetlands, and whether there are any regulatory hurdles that they knew of that are attached to those techniques. And we also asked if there were any additional comments that they would like to add. So the survey was designed to provide an account of the attitudes toward marsh remediation techniques and priorities. Below, you could see some examples of the questions that we asked. As you can see, we asked about Massachusetts Wetland Protection Act. We asked about remediation techniques. We asked if they felt local, state, and federal environmental policies are sufficient in ensuring protection to coastal habitats, and whether policymakers and regulators should consider exemptions allowing the testing of resilience building. So these are just a few examples of the types of questions we asked, and you could see a copy of our full survey in our final report. So here's a breakdown of the types of respondents that we surveyed. As you can see, the majority of respondents were scientists, although we had a good amount of resource managers, regulators, and land managers respond as well. Some of the 18% who chose other said they worked in mosquito control or some type of coordinator position, government program managers, educators, and in public health. The map on the right shows where each respondent conducts the majority of their work. The overwhelming majority of the state works in the state of Massachusetts, which wasn't very surprising for us because we sent out most of the people that we surveyed were in Massachusetts. However, we did want to capture the attitudes of practitioners in neighboring states as well. So as you can see, we have respondents from Rhode Island, New York, New Hampshire, Maine, and Connecticut. So here are some quick survey findings. We learned that 60% of respondents do not believe environmental policies in their state are sufficient in ensuring the protection of the coastal habitats. And 98% of respondents also agree that new science-based strategies are needed to increase coastal habitat resilience. And finally, 57% of respondents believe Massachusetts should consider exemptions for testing management techniques.
And so taking a deeper look at some of our survey results, this quote highlights a common feeling that was expressed by respondents throughout the survey. There is a bit of hesitation when it comes to trying innovative or experimental things in these vulnerable ecosystems. Many of the practitioners especially felt that their role right now is remedying past harms, including the harm that from actions that were done with seemingly good intentions. So there's this aversion to the idea of perpetuating the cycle of, as one of our respondents put it, mucking around in the marsh. And this quote as well captures another feeling that was commonly found throughout our results. So there's a perceived and likely an actual gap between the scientists and regulators working with marshes. For example, scientists feel that the allowed level of innovation is not adequate in the face of climate change. And meanwhile, regulators say that these innovative techniques could be permitted, but the scientists aren't bringing enough non-anecdotal evidence to support their permitting applications. And this lack of coordination is clearly a source of frustration for both parties, as is highlighted in this quote that speaks on the information gaps and the need for more coordination between parties involved. And so when asked about whether the existing regulations were sufficient, most of our respondents disagreed. And the general sentiment is that they are better than nothing because we do need to protect these vulnerable ecosystems, but especially in the face of climate change, they need to be adapted. There's a need for flexibility and discretion in interpretation that a few respondents highlighted, and one of them particularly emphasized the difference between the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. And this is a great point of contention between the scientists and the regulators, it seems, as the scientists feel that interpreting the Wetland Protection Act to the letter of the law and following it word for word prevents them from being innovative and productive in their work. And so for our final 3 questions, they were open-ended, and our team found that these questions had particularly meaningful results. And the feedback shown on this slide highlights the wide range of attitudes and opinions held by our respondents. Their ideas for what would be best for the marsh or wetlands would be ranging from leaving the marsh alone and letting it adapt to going in and heavily manipulating the natural system. We also found it interesting that several responses mentioned changes in human practices and behaviors, such as zoning changes and paying people to move out of their properties and allowing the marsh to migrate naturally, since we went in with the approach that something should be done to the marsh directly, but really a lot of the practitioners seem to feel that maybe humans should be the ones changing.
And so there were some limitations to our research that we think are important to cover. First of all, the survey population was limited. And as Danielle said, we had 116 people surveyed. And perhaps in the future, an even larger pool would have been preferred. Also, the respondents were primarily from the New England area, which raises questions as to whether the research is generalizable to other wetland regions and other regulatory frameworks. We also received the list of individuals to survey from our project partners, so it was not random. And this can pose as a potential limitation in the population being surveyed. Additionally, the design of the questions was critiqued by some of the respondents who felt that the questions were too broad for the topic. And it seemed that people wanted to provide a lot of nuance to the topic and to their answers. And that's why we left the fill in the blank option. But this might mean that in future research around this area, interviews may be preferred because then people can expand even further on their sentiment. And so implications for policy, we think this is an important component moving forward in how to address the marshland issues. A couple of respondents did not necessarily see issue in the permitting process around scientific studies while others did. And this may be important to consider for regulators and policymakers as they need to better educate stakeholders on the permitting process around scientific studies. And this may take the form of a comprehensive guide or other such resources that make it more understandable and more legible to the public and researchers. Also, the length of time and the costs incurred was something that a couple of respondents commented on. This may create unnecessary deterrence for practitioners that are otherwise trying to create positive, beneficial project proposals, but cannot get through the entirety of the permitting process. And also the trepidation from both scientists and researchers in instituting new techniques. As we've mentioned, there's historical basis for this, and that the marsh has been harmed in the past because of techniques used. But also thinking forward and thinking progressively into the future of the marsh and using science to inform decisions may alleviate some of this trepidation. And also, it's important to consider the anthropocentric focus of why the marshes are threatened originally, and that because there's been development along coastlines that have impacted the ability of marshlands to migrate and to continue to move. And then also the anthropogenic issues around climate change and sea level rise in the first place are important to consider in the evaluation of what to do for marshland habitats in the future. So going from this, some areas for future research based on our experiences We think that it could make a really interesting research approach to investigate, perhaps through interviews or other qualitative research methods, how this regulation is interpreted by various stakeholders. And this could include regulators, practitioners, scientists, researchers, etc., in understanding the different ways of seeing something that may be otherwise seen as objective. And additionally, exploring how individual restoration and remediation techniques may or may not be technically or perhaps bureaucratically feasible in specific areas, and what the very specific obstacles are for each technique. And thank you for coming to our talk and listening.